You're going to want to hear what happened in that room before you decide who was in control. I still remember the exact moment my wife looked at me like I was nothing more than background noise in her life, standing outside my small repair shop in downtown Chicago, arms crossed, eyes scanning the cracked sign above the door as if it offended her sense of success. My name is Michael Carter, and for the last 7 years I ran a modest repair business called Carter Fix and Repair, the kind of place people only notice when something breaks and they need it fixed fast. I never pretended it was glamorous, but it paid the bills, kept my hands busy, and gave me a reason to wake up before sunrise. My wife, Emily Carter, saw it differently. To her, it wasn't a business. It was a reminder of everything she believed I failed to become. She worked at Brightline Design Company, a fast-growing corporate firm that dealt with commercial property development, branding, and tenant consulting across the city. She liked structure, status, and environments where people spoke in numbers that ended with commas and dollar signs. I worked with broken pipes, damaged wiring, and people who just wanted things to function again. That difference alone seemed to widen the space between us every year we were married. That morning, the air outside the shop was cool, just under 60 degrees Fahrenheit, with a light wind pushing debris down the sidewalk. I was tightening the lock on my front door when Emily arrived in a black rideshare vehicle, stepping out like she was entering a place she didn't belong but felt entitled to evaluate. She didn't greet me right away. Instead, she looked around slowly, her eyes pausing on the faded paint, the small waiting bench, the tool racks visible through the glass window. Then she smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile you give someone you love. It was the kind you give something you've already judged. "This is what you do all day?" she asked, adjusting her handbag on her shoulder. I didn't answer immediately. I had learned that sometimes silence tells you more about a person's intention than their words ever could. Inside the shop, the smell of machine oil and old wood hung in the air, familiar and grounding to me, but apparently unimpressive to her. She stepped inside without asking, her heels clicking against the concrete floor, each step echoing like a countdown I didn't fully understand yet. "Michael, I just don't get it," she continued, glancing at a half-disassembled appliance on my workbench. "You've been doing this for years. Don't you ever want more than this?" Her tone wasn't angry. It was worse. It was disappointed, as if I had failed a test I didn't know I was taking. I wiped my hands on a rag and looked at her, trying to find something in her expression that resembled patience or curiosity, but there was only calculation. The kind of calculation people use when they're measuring whether something still fits into their future. What she didn't know, what she never took the time to understand, was that my world was never just this shop. There were things I kept private, not out of secrecy, but out of preference. Documents stored away, phone calls I never explained, meetings scheduled in buildings she never asked about. Not because I was hiding something harmful, but because I didn't believe every part of life needed to be broadcast to be real. Emily exhaled sharply, glancing at her watch. "I have a client meeting later today at Maple Street Business Center," she said casually, as if it didn't matter. I nodded slowly, because I knew that building. I knew it far better than she realized, but I said nothing. Instead, I watched her turn back toward the door, already mentally leaving the space she had just criticized. Before she stepped out, she paused, looked over her shoulder, and said the line that would echo longer than anything else that day. "Just don't expect this little shop of yours to impress anyone forever." Then she left, and for a moment, I stood there in the quiet hum of my own workspace, not reacting, not arguing, just thinking about how easily people overlook the ground they're standing on when they assume they already understand the entire map. The silence in my repair shop did not last long after she left, because silence never really stays silent when your mind starts replaying every detail you did not respond to in the moment. I stood there for a few seconds, still holding the rag in my hand, staring at the door she had just walked through, thinking about the way she looked at the space like it was something temporary, something beneath her standards, something she had already mentally removed from her future. I had seen that look before in smaller moments over the years, but never quite this sharp. I set the rag down, exhaled slowly, and returned to work, tightening a loose component on an old appliance, as if repetition could keep my thoughts from drifting. By noon, the shop had its usual rhythm again. Customers coming in with broken machines, a neighbor asking for help with a faulty water heater, and the steady hum of tools that made the world feel predictable. But beneath that rhythm, something had shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to make every small interaction feel slightly misaligned. Around 2 in the afternoon, I received a call from a property manager I had spoken with occasionally over the years, a man named Daniel Hughes. His voice was professional as always, but there was an unusual emphasis in his tone, like he was confirming something he already assumed I understood. He mentioned that there would be a scheduled review meeting the next morning at Maple Street Business Center involving all primary tenants and ownership representatives. I listened quietly, acknowledging the time and place, and when the call ended, I stood there for a moment longer than necessary. Maple Street Business Center was not just another building in the city. It was one of several properties I had acquired gradually over time through structured investments I never discussed at home. Not because I feared consequences, but because I never saw the need to merge every part of my life into one conversation. To me, ownership had always been something that functioned best when it remained functional rather than performative. That evening, Emily returned home later than usual, her heels tapping against the hardwood floor as she dropped her bag on the kitchen counter. She barely acknowledged me at first, scrolling through her phone while sipping a glass of water, already mentally elsewhere. When she finally spoke, it was about her day at Brightline Design Company, about upcoming negotiations with a tenant consulting group connected to Maple Street Business Center. She said the name casually, like it was just another item on her calendar, and I simply nodded, letting her talk without interruption. There was a confidence in her voice, the kind of confidence that comes from assuming the structure of the world is visible and fixed, where ownership and authority are always clearly labeled and never hidden beneath layers of paperwork and time. She never once asked who actually owned the building she would be entering the next morning. Later that night, I sat alone in the small office space behind the repair shop, reviewing documents spread across a wooden desk that had seen more years than I cared to count. The papers were not dramatic or flashy, just clean lines of legal structure, property deeds, and investment records that represented decisions made quietly over time. Each page told a different part of a story I never felt the need to announce. Outside, the city had settled into its nighttime pace, headlights moving past the shop window in slow intervals, casting brief reflections across the floor. I thought about Emily again, about the way she had spoken earlier, about the certainty in her dismissal of what she believed my life to be. It was not anger I felt, not even disappointment. It was something closer to distance, like watching someone describe a map while standing directly on top of the terrain they were misreading. The next morning arrived with a clear sky and temperatures hovering around 62 degrees Fahrenheit, a calm contrast to the quiet tension building in my mind. I left the shop earlier than usual, locking the front door behind me and taking a moment to look at the sign above it. Carter Fix and Repair had never been about appearances. It had always been about function, about consistency, about showing up when something needed to be restored. I got into my truck and drove toward Maple Street Business Center, not with urgency, but with steady familiarity. As I approached the building, I noticed employees already arriving, tenants moving in and out of the entrance, unaware of the administrative shift that was scheduled to unfold within the hour. Among them, I recognized Emily standing near the front steps, speaking with a colleague from Brightline Design Company, her posture confident, her expression focused. She had no idea that the meeting she was preparing for would not unfold the way she expected. She checked her watch once, then turned toward the entrance doors, walking inside with the same composed certainty she always carried into professional spaces. I parked across the street and remained in the vehicle for a moment, watching the flow of people entering the building. The morning felt ordinary to everyone passing by, structured and predictable, but I knew that within that structure, something fundamental was about to shift in a way none of them had accounted for. I stepped out of the truck and began walking toward the entrance, my pace steady, unhurried, as if I had done this 1,000 times before, because in many ways, I had. The walk from my truck to the entrance of Maple Street Business Center felt unremarkable to anyone watching from a distance. Just another person arriving for another routine morning in a building filled with offices and schedules, but I could feel a different weight in each step. Not pressure, not anxiety, just awareness of timing. The glass doors reflected the city behind me for a moment before sliding open, and I entered a lobby that smelled faintly of polished stone and fresh coffee. People moved through the space with the usual morning efficiency, checking phones, greeting colleagues, waiting for elevators that arrived and departed in quiet cycles. I did not stop to acknowledge anyone. I simply continued forward, following the familiar internal map I had built long before anyone else in this building thought about ownership or structure. On the second-floor conference level, a large meeting room had already begun to fill. I saw Emily before she saw me. She was standing near the center of a small group from Brightline Design Company, speaking with controlled confidence, her hands moving slightly as she explained something on a tablet screen. She looked exactly as she always did in professional spaces, composed, precise, certain. Around her, other tenants and representatives from various companies were settling into seats, exchanging polite conversation that carried the usual undertone of routine business expectations. A long rectangular table had been set at the front of the room, with printed agendas placed at each seat, all aligned with careful symmetry. Daniel Hughes, the property manager I had spoken with the day before, stood near the front, checking notes and occasionally glancing toward the entrance as more attendees arrived. When I stepped into the room, there was no immediate reaction. I chose a seat near the middle of the table, placing myself among individuals who had no reason to assign meaning to my presence beyond what they could see. Emily did not look at me at first. Her attention remained focused on a colleague who was discussing projected lease adjustments for the upcoming quarter. It was only when Daniel cleared his throat and moved toward the front podium that the room began to settle into silence. He reviewed a few introductory remarks about operational updates and tenant coordination, his voice steady and professional, the kind of voice used in spaces where structure matters more than emotion. Then he paused, glanced at a document in his hand, and looked up. There was a brief shift in his expression, subtle but noticeable to anyone paying attention to detail. He continued speaking, announcing that there had been a finalized administrative transition regarding ownership oversight of Maple Street Business Center. The words were simple, but the effect in the room was immediate. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, pens paused above notebooks, and attention gradually converged toward the front without anyone fully understanding why. Emily straightened slightly in her seat, her focus sharpening as she listened more carefully. Daniel continued, explaining that the updated ownership representative would now be directly involved in lease coordination, tenant agreements, and structural planning moving forward. He gestured toward the entrance of the room as he finished speaking. The silence that followed was not dramatic, but it was complete. I stood up. There was no rush in the movement, no hesitation, no need for announcement beyond presence itself. Chairs shifted subtly as attention followed the motion across the room. I walked toward the front, past rows of tenants, past the Brightline Design Company team, past the carefully arranged expectations of a meeting that had begun under assumptions that no longer applied. When I reached the front, I stopped beside Daniel, who stepped slightly aside without needing instruction. I looked across the room briefly, not searching for reactions, but acknowledging the space as it existed in that moment. Emily's eyes met mine. The expression on her face did not change immediately. There was recognition first, then confusion, then a slow recalibration of understanding that did not yet have language. She looked at the front podium, then back at me, as if attempting to reconcile two versions of reality that refused to align. Daniel formally introduced me as the primary ownership representative for Maple Street Business Center and affiliated properties under consolidated management. The words were standard, procedural, but in that room, they landed differently. I did not speak at length. I simply confirmed presence, confirmed authority, and acknowledged that all lease operations would continue under the same structure, with direct oversight moving forward. The explanation was brief, because it did not need to be anything more than clear. Around the room, subtle shifts began to appear in posture and attention. People who had been casually reviewing notes now sat more upright, recalculating assumptions that had existed only moments before. Emily remained still, her hands now resting on the table, no longer gesturing. The confidence she had carried into the building earlier that morning had not disappeared, but it had changed shape, as if it had encountered a boundary it did not anticipate. I looked at her again, not with confrontation, but with calm acknowledgement, the kind that comes when there is nothing left to clarify. The room remained quiet, waiting for what would come next, but nothing immediate followed. Instead, the meeting transitioned forward under new terms of understanding, where the structure of authority had not changed, only become visible. The room did not immediately return to normal after the introduction, because once a hierarchy shifts in a place like this, even slightly, people begin to reconsider everything they thought they understood about the environment they are standing in. The meeting continued under Daniel Hughes's direction, but the tone had changed in ways that were subtle yet impossible to ignore if you were paying attention. Lease updates were presented, maintenance schedules were reviewed, and tenant obligations were outlined with the same professional structure as before, but every statement now carried a different weight because the assumption of distance between decision maker and observer had been removed. I remained at the front of the room, not because I needed to occupy the space, but because that was where I was already positioned in relation to what this building represented. Emily had not spoken since the announcement. Her posture was still controlled, but something in the stillness had changed. It was not shock in the exaggerated sense people imagine. It was the slower kind of recalibration, where the mind continues processing a fact it does not yet want to assign meaning to. When her eyes met mine again, there was no expression of anger or disbelief, only a quiet search for continuity, as if she were trying to locate the version of events that made sense within her previous understanding of me. That version no longer existed in this space. Daniel transitioned to discussing Brightline Design Company specifically, referencing their lease renewal timeline and upcoming compliance review. Emily shifted slightly in her seat at the mention of her company, her attention sharpening again as the professional instinct reasserted itself. She spoke briefly, asking a procedural question about terms adjustment, her voice steady but noticeably more measured than before. The response she received was calm and factual, confirming that all tenant agreements would proceed under revised oversight protocols moving forward. There was no confrontation in the exchange, only structure replacing assumption. I observed the interaction without interruption. It was not necessary to insert emotion into a system that functioned on documentation and agreement. After several more agenda points, Daniel concluded the formal portion of the meeting and opened the floor for individual questions. A few tenants raised standard concerns about parking allocations, maintenance response times, and scheduled renovations. Each question was addressed in sequence, efficiently, and without deviation. During this time, Emily remained mostly silent, her focus now divided between the documents in front of her and the reality she was still processing. At one point, she looked down at her printed lease agreement, scanning the header where the ownership details were listed. I could see the moment her attention paused there longer than it should have, as if the information had always been present but never properly registered. When the meeting began to wind down, people started gathering their materials and preparing to leave. Chairs moved, papers were stacked, and conversations resumed in low tones that carried a different energy than when the room had first filled. Emily remained seated for a few seconds longer than the others, her gaze fixed forward, no longer scanning the room, but focused inward. I stepped away from the front area, moving toward the side of the room where the exit corridor connected to the hallway. As I passed her table, she finally spoke, her voice low enough that it was not meant for the entire room, but clear enough that I heard it directly. She asked a simple question, not about ownership or structure, but about why I had never mentioned any of this before. There was no accusation in her tone at first, only confusion layered with something more fragile underneath. I paused briefly, not because I did not have an answer, but because the answer itself was not complicated enough to match the weight she seemed to assign to it. I told her that not everything in life requires announcement to remain real, and not every decision is made for visibility. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked at the table in front of her, then at the document in her hands again, as if searching for a detail that would restore the version of understanding she had brought into the building that morning. Around us, the room had nearly cleared. The professional atmosphere was dissolving back into routine motion, but between us there was a pause that did not belong to the meeting itself. It belonged to the space between expectation and reality, where assumptions lose their structure but have not yet been replaced by something new. I continued walking toward the hallway exit, not hurried, not delayed, simply moving forward as the environment returned to its normal rhythm behind me. Emily remained seated for a moment longer, still holding the lease document, still processing information that had been technically present long before it became meaningful. The difference now was not in what had changed, but in what could no longer be overlooked. By the time I reached the hallway outside the conference room, the sound of the meeting had already begun to fade behind me, replaced by the quieter rhythm of the building returning to its normal operations. Elevator doors opened and closed in steady intervals. Footsteps moved across polished floors, and voices returned in low conversations that had nothing to do with what had just shifted inside that room. I walked without urgency, following the corridor that led back toward the main lobby, but I could feel that the moment I had just left behind was still unfolding for others in ways I did not need to witness directly. People often assume that change is loud, but in spaces like this, change is usually silent and delayed, spreading through understanding rather than sound. Behind me, Emily remained in the conference room longer than anyone else from her team. When she finally stood, she did so slowly, collecting her documents with movements that were precise but slightly less confident than before. Her colleague from Brightline Design Company asked her a question, something about scheduling follow-up discussions, but she responded without her usual certainty, her attention divided between the present conversation and whatever had just rewritten her internal map of the situation. She left the room a few minutes later, walking into the hallway with her phone already in hand. The first call she made was to Daniel Hughes. I was already in my truck by the time she reached the lobby. I had not rushed out of the building, nor had I stayed to observe reactions. There was no need for either. I started the engine, let it idle for a moment, and watched people continue their day through the windshield as if nothing fundamental had changed in their environment. That is the part most people misunderstand about structure. It does not announce itself when it becomes visible. It simply functions, and those who were unaware of it begin to adjust their understanding after the fact. Emily stood outside the building entrance while her call connected. I saw her briefly through the glass doors before I pulled away from the curb. Her posture was still composed, but there was a stillness in her movements that did not belong to routine thought. Daniel answered her call after a short delay. I would learn later that she asked him to confirm details about ownership records, lease authority, and structural management of Maple Street Business Center. His responses were factual, consistent with everything that had already been formally presented inside the meeting. There were no contradictions, no corrections, only confirmation of what had been established as standard operating structure. By the time I returned to Carter Fix and Repair, the afternoon had settled into a quiet pace. The shop looked the same as it always did, small, functional, slightly worn at the edges, with tools arranged according to habit rather than presentation. I opened the front door, stepped inside, and allowed the familiar environment to reset the rhythm of my thoughts. Inside, there were no expectations from anyone else, no shifting perceptions, no recalculations happening in real time based on new information. There was only work that needed to be done and problems that required attention. I checked a repair schedule on the counter, reviewed a few pending requests, and began organizing parts for a job scheduled later in the week. The simplicity of the tasks contrasted sharply with the complexity that had unfolded earlier, but I did not separate the two in my mind. Both were simply systems operating at different scales. Around the same time, Emily was still processing information that refused to settle into a comfortable category. In her office at Brightline Design Company, she sat at her desk with printed documents spread in front of her, including lease agreements and tenant summaries related to Maple Street Business Center. The name that had once represented a standard client property now carried additional meaning that had not been present before that morning. She reviewed the ownership section again, slower this time, confirming what she had already heard but not yet fully absorbed. Her colleague asked if everything was all right, noting her silence during a brief planning discussion, but she responded that she was simply reviewing details. It was not untrue, but it was incomplete. Later that evening, she requested a full internal file review from her department regarding all properties managed under Brightline Design Company. That request was procedural on the surface, but it carried an underlying shift in intent. It was no longer about routine business coordination. It was about understanding context that had been previously overlooked. Meanwhile, I remained at the shop as daylight faded outside, moving through the end of the day's work with steady familiarity. A customer came in with a damaged appliance. Another called about a delayed repair estimate, and I handled each task without interruption. Yet in the quiet moments between work, my thoughts returned briefly to the meeting room, not with reflection on what had been revealed, but on the simplicity of how perception can exist so confidently without awareness of its own limits. By the time the city outside settled into evening, both of our environments had returned to their surface-level normality. Lights turned on in offices, traffic slowed on nearby streets, and conversations resumed in homes and workplaces. But beneath that normality, the structure of understanding had already shifted, and once that kind of shift begins, it rarely stays contained within a single moment. The next morning did not begin with urgency, but with a quiet sense of recalibration that had become familiar over the past day, as if both my routine and the city around me were continuing forward while carrying information that had not yet fully settled into everyday behavior. I arrived at Carter Fix and Repair just after sunrise, the air still cool enough to leave a faint trace of breath in front of the shop door. The street outside was already active with early deliveries and commuters, but my workspace remained unchanged, tools in their familiar places, shelves lined with parts ordered over time rather than displayed for appearance. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, letting the normal sounds of the shop re-establish themselves around me. A few minutes later, I noticed a message on my phone from Daniel Hughes. It was brief, professional, and direct. He confirmed that Brightline Design Company had requested additional documentation regarding ownership structure and tenant coordination authority for Maple Street Business Center. There was no tone of concern in the message, only procedural clarity, but I understood what it represented. It was the natural next step when information collides with expectations that had previously been unchallenged. I replied with a simple acknowledgement and continued organizing my workspace, placing the phone back on the counter without further attention. Around mid-morning, Emily arrived at her office earlier than usual. According to later accounts from her assistant, she did not begin her day with meetings or calls, but instead spent the first hour reviewing internal records and lease documentation related to Maple Street Business Center. She asked specific questions about ownership verification, signature authority, and the historical timeline of property management decisions. Her tone remained controlled, but the focus behind her questions had changed. It was no longer routine business curiosity. It was reconstruction of understanding. At the shop, I received a call from an older client requesting a same-day repair for a commercial appliance malfunction. I agreed, gathered the necessary tools, and drove to the location without interruption. The job itself was straightforward, requiring standard replacement work and calibration. The simplicity of physical systems has always contrasted with the complexity of human interpretation. Machines respond predictably when repaired correctly. People do not always adjust so cleanly when their assumptions are repaired. By early afternoon, Daniel called again, this time with more detail. He informed me that Brightline Design Company had formally requested clarification regarding whether any changes in ownership structure would affect existing lease agreements or operational stability. His tone remained neutral, but there was an underlying acknowledgement that these inquiries were increasing in depth. I told him to maintain standard documentation protocols and assured him that all tenant agreements would continue under unchanged operational terms. There was no need for escalation, only clarity. After the call ended, I stood in the shop for a moment longer than necessary, looking out through the front window at the street beyond. The world outside continued its normal rhythm, pedestrians moving between buildings, vehicles passing in steady intervals, storefronts opening and closing according to schedule. Nothing about the external environment reflected the internal adjustments happening within a few individuals connected to the same structure. That is often how systems function when they are not recognized in advance. They remain invisible until they are referenced directly. Later that afternoon, Emily met with her direct supervisor at Brightline Design Company. The conversation, as later summarized in internal notes, centered on verifying contractual accuracy and ensuring that all property relationships aligned with corporate compliance standards. Emily presented printed documents and highlighted sections related to Maple Street Business Center, focusing on ownership designation and decision-making authority. Her supervisor, a woman with extensive experience in commercial property coordination, reviewed the materials carefully before confirming that the documentation was consistent with established records. There was no contradiction found. only confirmation of what had already been recorded within legal frameworks. Still, Emily did not appear satisfied in the way she usually did after resolving professional uncertainty. Instead, she requested additional verification from external registry sources, indicating a need to fully reconcile perception with fact. Back at the repair shop, the afternoon moved toward evening with steady predictability. I completed the commercial repair job, returned to the shop, and handled a few additional customer requests. One involved a residential plumbing issue that required a replacement valve. Another involved a diagnostic check on a malfunctioning appliance motor. Each task was completed in sequence, without interruption or deviation. Work, in its most basic form, does not require emotional interpretation. It requires execution. As daylight faded outside and the city transitioned into evening lighting, I noticed another message waiting on my phone. It was from Emily. It was not long. It simply asked for confirmation of whether I would be available to discuss the situation later that evening. There was no clarification needed regarding what she meant. I responded that I would be available after closing the shop. After sending the message, I set the phone down and continued working until the last task of the day was completed. The repair shop gradually quieted as closing time approached. I turned off the main lights, secured the front door, and remained inside for a few additional minutes before leaving. The space felt unchanged, yet the events of the past 2 days had added a layer of awareness that did not alter its physical structure, but shifted how it was understood. I locked the shop, stepped outside, and looked down the emptying street as evening settled over the city. Somewhere across town, Emily was preparing for a conversation that had moved beyond documentation and into direct acknowledgement. And between those 2 points, the same structure continued to exist, unchanged in form, but increasingly impossible to interpret in the same way as before. By the time I closed the repair shop that evening, the air outside had cooled into the kind of late day temperature that settles across the city like a slow exhale, and I could feel the weight of the upcoming conversation waiting for me not as tension, but as timing. I drove back through familiar streets, traffic lights shifting from green to yellow in steady rhythm, and I kept my focus forward, not because I was avoiding thought, but because there was nothing uncertain left to analyze. When I arrived home, the house was already lit, the warm glow from the living room spilling slightly into the hallway. Emily's car was in the driveway. She had arrived before me. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, noticing immediately that the usual sounds of the house were absent. No television in the background, no music, no movement beyond the faint presence of someone waiting in another room. I placed my keys on the small table near the entrance and walked toward the kitchen before she spoke. Her voice came from the living room, calm but deliberate, asking me to sit down. When I entered the space, she was already seated on the couch, a set of printed documents placed neatly on the coffee table in front of her. They were not scattered or disorganized. Everything about her posture and arrangement suggested preparation rather than impulse. I sat across from her without resistance. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was not unfamiliar, but it felt structured in a different way than before, as if it had shifted from distance to evaluation. She began by referencing the meeting at Maple Street Business Center, stating that she had spent the day reviewing official records, lease agreements, and ownership documentation. Her tone remained controlled, but there was an underlying precision to her words that came from repetition rather than emotion. She confirmed that the records all aligned with what had been formally presented, and that there was no discrepancy in legal ownership designation. Then she paused, looking at me directly for the first time since I entered the room. What followed was not an accusation, nor an emotional outburst. It was a question framed carefully, asking how long I had been aware of the full scope of what she now understood. I did not respond immediately, not because I was avoiding the question, but because the answer required context she was only now beginning to reconstruct. I told her that awareness is not always introduced in a single moment, and that sometimes it exists quietly long before it becomes relevant to anyone else's understanding. She looked down briefly at the documents in front of her, then back at me, as if measuring whether that explanation aligned with what she had already concluded internally. The papers on the table represented more than property records. They represented the collapse of an assumption that had structured her understanding of me for years. She asked another question, this time more direct, asking why I had not shared any of this with her during our marriage. There was no anger in her voice, only a need to assign meaning to something that no longer fit into the narrative she had carried. I considered the question carefully before answering. I told her that not everything that exists within a person's life is presented as shared identity, and that some decisions are made without the expectation of external validation or explanation. The words were simple, but they were not received simply. She leaned back slightly, exhaling in a controlled manner, her gaze shifting away from me toward the window behind the couch. Outside, the streetlights had already turned on, casting soft reflections across the glass. Inside the room, the lighting remained steady, unchanged, as if the environment itself had not yet registered the shift in understanding taking place between us. After a few moments, she returned her attention to the documents again, flipping through a few pages with slower movement than before. The familiarity she once had with the structure of her professional world was now intersecting with something she had not accounted for in her personal one. She asked if the ownership structure would affect Brightline Design Company in any immediate operational way. I told her it would not, that all existing agreements would remain in effect, and that the purpose of oversight was continuity rather than disruption. My response was factual, without emphasis or persuasion, because there was no need to shape interpretation beyond accuracy. She nodded slightly, but the gesture was not fully anchored in agreement. It was more reflective, as if acknowledging information that still needed time to settle into place. The conversation did not escalate. There were no raised voices, no abrupt emotional shifts, only a gradual movement through clarification. Yet beneath that surface calm, something fundamental had already changed. The version of understanding she had carried into that morning no longer aligned with the structure she was now standing within. After a final moment of silence, she closed the documents and placed them back on the table. Her posture remained composed, but her focus had shifted inward. I stood up first, not as an ending gesture, but because there was nothing further required in that moment that could be resolved through repetition. I told her that clarity does not always arrive with comfort, and then walked toward the hallway without waiting for a response. Behind me, she remained seated for a few seconds longer, still looking at the space where the documents had been, as if waiting for the version of reality she had known to reassemble itself. But nothing in the room moved back toward what it had been before. And as I reached the hallway and turned off the light behind me, the house remained quiet, not because nothing had changed, but because what had changed no longer needed to announce itself in order to remain present. The following morning arrived with a quiet sense of finality that neither of us had spoken about directly, but both of us seemed to understand in different ways. I left the house early, before the sun had fully climbed above the rooftops, and drove toward Carter Fix and Repair with the same steady rhythm I had maintained for years, though the meaning behind that routine now felt slightly different. The streets were lightly active, with commuters moving in predictable patterns, coffee shops opening their doors, and delivery trucks pausing briefly at intersections before continuing on. Everything looked normal, because on the surface, nothing had changed in how the city functioned. When I arrived at the shop, I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, immediately returning to the familiar environment of tools, parts, and quiet order. I did not turn on music or distraction. Instead, I focused on preparing for the day ahead, reviewing scheduled repairs, and organizing incoming requests. Around mid-morning, Daniel Hughes called again. His tone was the same as before, professional and direct, but this time there was a slight emphasis on confirmation rather than notification. He informed me that Brightline Design Company had completed their internal review and had accepted all structural clarifications regarding Maple Street Business Center. There were no further compliance concerns, and all lease operations would continue under existing agreements without interruption. I acknowledged the update and ended the call without additional discussion. There was nothing further required from my side in that exchange. Later that day, Emily left her office earlier than usual. According to what was later described by her assistant, she had spent most of the morning reviewing documentation and cross-referencing internal property records, followed by a series of short meetings with her department supervisors. Her questions had become more precise, focusing less on what was happening and more on how it had been allowed to exist without her awareness. There was no dramatic shift in her outward behavior, but those who worked closely with her noticed a quiet change in her usual decisiveness, as if her internal framework for interpreting professional environments had been temporarily interrupted. She returned home in the late afternoon, parking her car in the driveway and remaining inside for a few minutes before entering the house. I was already there, having returned from a service call earlier in the day, organizing tools in the garage before stepping inside. When she entered, she did not immediately speak. Instead, she placed her bag on the kitchen counter and stood for a moment in silence, as if deciding how to begin a conversation that no longer had a clear starting point. Eventually, she asked if we could talk again, not in the same way as the night before, but with a different intention. We moved to the living room, sitting in the same positions as before, though the atmosphere between us had shifted from confrontation to something closer to structured reflection. She began by acknowledging that her understanding of my professional life had been incomplete, not in a dismissive way, but in a way that suggested she was trying to reconcile two versions of reality that had never fully overlapped. She asked again why none of it had ever been part of our shared conversations, and this time the question carried less uncertainty and more an attempt to define boundaries between personal expectation and individual autonomy. I told her that certain parts of life are built quietly over time, and not every structure is designed to be explained in real time to those who assume visibility equals completeness. She listened without interruption, her attention focused, but not reactive. After a pause, she asked whether I had ever intended for her to know, or whether separation between those aspects of life had been deliberate from the beginning. I answered that intention was not about concealment, but about independence of structure, and that not everything requires shared observation to remain valid. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked down at her hands for a moment, then toward the window, where the late afternoon light was beginning to soften across the street outside. There was no anger in her expression, but there was a clear recognition that something foundational had shifted in how she interpreted not just my life, but the assumptions she had carried about proximity and understanding within a marriage. After several moments, she spoke again, this time more quietly, saying that she did not know how to adjust to a version of reality where so much could exist without her awareness. The statement was not directed as blame, but as acknowledgement of displacement. I told her that adjustment is not immediate, and that understanding often arrives in layers rather than conclusions. The conversation did not move toward resolution, nor did it need to. It simply continued until silence became the natural resting point, between words rather than resistance. Eventually, she stood up and walked toward the hallway, pausing briefly before disappearing from view. I remained in the living room for a few moments longer, not analyzing what had been said, but observing the absence of urgency that now defined the space between us. Outside, the city continued its normal rhythm, unaffected by internal recalibration happening within individual lives. I eventually stood, turned off the remaining lights, and moved toward the kitchen. The house remained quiet, not because nothing remained unresolved, but because the structure of what had changed no longer required immediate explanation in order to exist. The days that followed did not bring any dramatic resolution, but instead settled into a quieter form of understanding that neither demanded confrontation nor avoided it. Life returned to motion in the way it always does when major internal shifts have already occurred but external structures remain intact. I continued working at Carter Fix and Repair with the same schedule, opening the shop early, handling repair requests, and maintaining the steady rhythm of tasks that defined my routine for years. The city around me continued without interruption, traffic patterns unchanged, storefronts opening and closing, people moving through their lives with priorities that had nothing to do with the events that had recently unfolded between two individuals inside a single household. At home, Emily and I did not discuss the situation further in any structured or decisive way. There were no arguments, no attempts to reframe or redefine what had already been acknowledged. Instead, there was distance that was no longer confusing, only present. Conversations became functional, focused on logistics of daily life rather than interpretation of identity or history. Meals were quiet, mornings were organized, evenings were predictable in a way that no longer carried expectation of emotional alignment. It was not separation in the formal sense, but it was no longer the same form of shared understanding that had existed before. One afternoon, I received a final call from Daniel Hughes. His tone carried the same professionalism as before, but the purpose of the call was procedural closure. He confirmed that all administrative reviews related to Maple Street Business Center had been completed and archived according to standard compliance requirements. There were no remaining inquiries from Brightline Design Company or any other tenants. The matter, in an official capacity, was concluded. I acknowledged the information and thanked him before ending the call. There was nothing more to address in that framework. Later that week, Emily informed me that she would be taking additional time at her office to reorganize several ongoing projects. Her explanation was practical, focused on workload and scheduling adjustments, but it also carried an implicit recognition that her professional environment required recalibration after recent events. She did not frame it in emotional terms, nor did she need to. The adjustment was already visible in her behavior, in the way she structured her time more deliberately, and in the way she approached information with increased verification before acceptance. At home, the space between us remained stable but unforced. There was no attempt to reconstruct previous dynamics, nor any effort to replace them with artificial alternatives. Instead, there was a gradual acceptance of a new form of coexistence that did not rely on shared assumptions to function. I continued my work, and she continued hers, each within separate frameworks that no longer intersected in the way they once had, but still shared the same physical space without conflict. One evening, while closing the shop, I paused for a moment before turning off the lights. The room was quiet, tools arranged, surfaces cleared, everything returned to its expected order. I thought briefly about how structure itself does not depend on visibility to exist, and how understanding often changes not when information is revealed, but when interpretation finally adjusts to what has already been present. I locked the front door and stepped outside into the evening air. The street was calm, illuminated by evenly spaced lights, with no urgency in movement or sound. I walked to my truck, started the engine, and sat for a moment before driving home. There was no anticipation of conversation waiting for me there, only the continuation of a reality that had already shifted into its final form. When I arrived, the house was lit softly from within. Emily was inside, moving through her own quiet routine. We acknowledged each other briefly, not with distance or tension, but with recognition of a shared environment that no longer required explanation. I placed my keys down, moved through the hallway, and continued forward into the evening without looking back. Nothing had returned to what it once was, because nothing needed to. What had changed had already completed its transition, and what remained was simply the continuation of life under a different understanding of the same space.